Hey guys, I just want to share a quick game with you where I employ the Scandinavian defence playing with the black pieces against the player who's rated 1105, and it's just an interesting and instructive game that you might want to look into, might inspire you to maybe pick up the Scandinavian a little bit yourself. So the Scandinavian is typified by the opening moves e4 and then d5. So with d5, black is obviously offering up an exchange in the middle of the board, which would mean that most likely black's queen's pawn and white's e-pawn will not be on the board for very long, and that can influence the shape of the game. The most common response to this is e takes d5, obviously. Now the classical response here is for queen to capture on d5, but I've said this before if you've watched a few of my videos. Anytime I see the Scandinavian and I see queen takes d5, it's pretty straightforward. Let me just flip the board, because you know what I will then just do is develop my knight to c3, attacking the queen and forcing the queen to move. And there are a few squares where the queen might typically go to, but generally I'm always comfortable in this kind of situation, so no real problem there whatsoever. I don't play that approach. I play knight to f6, which is called the modern variation of the Scandinavian, and it can lead to the Icelandic gambit. I've got a video on that if you want to check that out. It's pretty cool. It's not the toughest or most dangerous of traps, but it can be useful. So in this game, my opponent then followed up with bishop to c4. Now, so my opponent's rated 1100, and that's not, it's not a beginner kind of standard. So he's in the top half of all chess players on chess.com, because the median is about 1050, right? So this is an interesting conundrum, really, and this is something that beginners, lower rated players, improving players very often do, which is you've just been offered a free pawn and then you try and hang on to your extra pawn. But the act of hanging on to the extra pawn can severely weaken you or put you at an early disadvantage in the game, and that's one of the dangers of gambits. So gambits are normally where one player will offer up one or two or even sometimes three pawns, or maybe even a piece, in the first few moves of the game. And the reason is that because your opponent is having to use his moves to capture those pieces, he's not using those moves to develop his own pieces. So you can develop while he's eating pawns, and then hopefully you will get good compensation through your accelerated development. Okay, so here I don't think this makes any sense whatsoever. Why? Because he's just put one defender on this pawn and I've got two attackers. So it's not defending the pawn. I can have the pawn anyway if I want to have the pawn. So I do. I just grab the pawn, and now I think this is another inaccuracy from white, simply to capture the knight. And now my queen comes out into the board, and now it looks like I'm playing with the white pieces. And I am actually ahead. I've got a piece in the board, which also happens to be attacking an undefended pawn, right? And white has nothing. White has got a disappeared bishop and a disappeared pawn, right? So that's it. So I don't think that was really well thought through. I think initially, when this is a doubled up pawn, it's very advanced up the board. I would forget about this pawn if I were white, and I think about developing. I think bring my knights out, get my bishop onto the board somewhere, right? But don't bring your bishop out and then swap it off and put yourself in on the back foot. So I recaptured the queen. Now he decides to develop a piece, and clearly it's blocking my queen's assault against g2. So breaking one of the early principles, I move my developed piece again, But there's a reason to this, a very good reason, okay? Think it through. And I talked to myself about this when I played the move. So there is no piece that can interpose and break this check other than Mrs. White, okay, who can get in the way. So White's got two options. King moves to f1, thereby losing castling rights, or Queen moves to e2, in which case I can grab the Queen and White is forced to recapture and White loses castling rights. So he goes for that option. Queen moves to e2, Queen takes e2, King takes e2, and now if you notice, material is equal, but the initiative is all with black. I mean, it looks like there's nothing happening on the board, but White, having lost the ability to castle and also doesn't have the bishop pair anymore, this could turn out to be decisive. So let's see how the game goes, and it really is quite crushing, really. So I bring out my Queen's Knight. King decides to move backwards, so again losing tempo. I bring my knight out now again, so again it's unprincipled, but you can see what I'm trying to do. I'm attacking the c2 pawn, and if I can get the c2 pawn, then that's a fork on the king and the rook, so the king is forced to move. Another thing is that I am moving my knight further up the board into my enemy's territory, which could create opportunities to cause my enemy some headaches. So the king again so he's made another king move, right? So now I bring my bishop out to g4, pinning the knight, right? It's another problem in White's mind. And so effectively that knight cannot move, so it can't be used defensively or offensively, it's pinned. White tries to kick my knight with a3, and I decide to grab his knight and force his pawns not only to double but isolate. So he's now got doubled and isolated pawns on the f-file, one isolated pawn on the h-file, and because he was in check, he had to do something about that, so it was forced. He had to bring the bishop back, and now I just drop my knight back to c6. I figure it's happy in that situation. I've got the upper hand in the game, and I'll put it on a square where it's at least defended. Okay, White develops a knight, and I castle queenside, which has the advantage because my d-pawn, remember offering up my d-pawn earlier on in the game, clearing my side of the d-file at least, makes castling queenside more appealing because it drops the rook straight onto the semi-open file. Okay, d3 is played, that seems to make sense, and now my knight comes in again, now attacking another vulnerable piece. So you can see from the very beginning of this game, White has never been able to get a foothold in the game so far. He's not been able to think about his own plans. He's from accepting that first offered pawn and then making an ill-judged defense of his extra pawn, he's spent the entire game so far on the back foot. Bishop comes out to attack the knight, but that does nothing. He really should have just pushed the pawn forward to f4, where it would have at least been protected by the bishop. So what's he thinking? Is he thinking, well, if the knight moves, I can grab a7? But beware, right? If you will see this a lot in chess. You'll see it an awful lot, okay? Particularly when the king is castled queenside, which means the king is 2 squares away from the edge of the board, right? Which means the king is not guarding the edge pawn, right? But you've got to be very careful because of this move, right? The pawn moves forward, the bishop is now trapped. Okay, the knight comes in, but it's a bit desperate because I can actually now chase that knight off by playing my knight to d4. So I'm now threatening to capture his knight and then his bishop, so he swaps off knights, my rook comes out. Now he puts his rook onto a semi-open file. It's okay, g7 is currently defended by the bishop, I'm not too concerned about that, so I keep the pressure up, keep the boot on the neck, and attack the bishop with my king. Bishop grabs a pawn as some compensation, and the bishop falls. So now I decide to harass the rook. Rook has to drop back, because the rook actually hasn't got any, can't go there, 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 or there, or there, or there. Right, so it hasn't got very many squares on that 5th rank. So it drops back to g3. I decide to strengthen my pawn chain and also at the same time defend my rook. a4 is played. I block it off with my king. So I've got ideas now about moving my bishop out when I can. I don't want to leave this pawn undefended, but I do want to move my bishop out. The big difference in the game is, I mean, both our kings are out in the open. It's a very open game. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to be exciting. The big differences are, one, I have a nice pawn structure here that's pretty solid, whereas white has these horrible single pawns on that side of the board, and of course I have a bishop. So, you know, I need to make use of my advantages. You want to maximize your own advantages and minimize your own disadvantages in the game. So pawn comes out to kick the rook. That's not a problem because I've now got 2 attackers on there, and that was the point of putting the king up there. And white decides, probably foolishly, to exchange rooks. When you are down in material, it does not serve you generally to go into equal exchanges and swap off material. Okay, king comes out, I push h5, so now obviously my plan is to push g5, where this pawn is no longer threatened, enabling my bishop maybe to move. Rook comes out, my rook goes to g8 to defend the pawn, king starts to come back now. I don't want my king too far out in the open, I don't want it to get stranded, but I figure it's okay here. And now I come towards the rook. Rooks don't like, they're not very good at close quarter combat, right? They don't like you getting in their face. So now this rook cannot counterattack the king, right? Because it can only move right next to the king, it's going to get taken. So that really neutralizes that threat of the rook. Rook moves, now I put my bishop here, where it's acting really like a tall pawn. It's just filling in the gap in the pawn chain. A very comfortable situation. Again, I move into the rook space, and now I'm starting to put my king into safety. Rook comes back here, but I'm unconcerned, so I can now start to push my pawns up, where I've got this nice advantage here on the king side of the board. And white starts to push his pawn, which is a decent move. It's what he should be doing. I mean, one advantage that white has, you could argue, is he's got 3 pawns on the B, C, D files to my 1 pawn. Okay? That is white's only advantage that you could claim in this game. Therefore, he should be playing to his advantage. Okay, so he's pushing the pawn forwards. I give check, skewering the king, winning a pawn. And now the pawn comes in, but this is not... I'm not worried about this. I've calculated this, so I know that I can move my king to here. He can't check because... no, my pawn can't capture that way, but he can't check because the king captures. If pawn captures, I've got bishop captures. If he tries to maneuver his rook around, I can just grab with the pawn, and I think I'll be absolutely fine. In fact, that's what he does. a7, I grab the pawn, he comes up, I defend with the bishop. There's no point really defending here because I could have a pawn coming in, takes. I guess my bishop could then take, but I'm just playing it safe. And now I grab the other pawn, pawn comes in, I take it, it's a free pawn. He does then capture on f6, which I hadn't noticed with that capture, but it's all really too little too late now for white. And he finishes with a blunder, really. Blunders his rook, and there's really nothing left to do. So a very, very straightforward finish. White actually has these squares to roam, so all his king can do is pace backwards and forwards now, because my rook is defended by a pawn, and look, I've got this nice h-pawn, which you'll see just comes in to finish. And in fact, I pre-moved all these last like 5 moves. Just promote to a rook, and then simple checkmate. Okay, so a crushing victory, where I really did feel like I had the upper hand right from the start. I do recommend that you look into the Scandinavian, look particularly as well into the Icelandic Gambit, which can be quite interesting. it can surprise your opponents. Opponents who play e4 may be expecting e5. They're not expecting d5. So give it a whirl and good luck. See you later.